Good morning, St. Andrew's friends. My mind has been on the word wilderness this week. Once Jesus had been baptized, he turned away from people and he spent 40 days in the wilderness to fast, to pray, to prepare for his ministry. But this wasn't some sort of romantic camping trip that Jesus took in order to get back to his roots. In the Gospel of Mark, it says that it was the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, who forced Jesus and sent Jesus out into the wilderness. Spirit knew that this was a necessary step for Jesus. He wasn't ready yet to begin his ministry. He had to wrestle with his inner demons before he was ready to take on the shortcomings and missteps of humanity. The idea of physician heal thyself comes to mind. So Jesus had to do his inner work before he was ready to lead people in a healthy and spirit-filled way. And that is good advice for all of us to take. We may not become full-time preachers or healers or social activists like Jesus, but for the work that we hope to do, whether that's within our own households or within our communities, it's good to clear house before we begin. Get rid of those things which hold us back or hold us down before we attempt to lead or help liberate others. I'm not saying that you have to be perfect in order to help others, because if that were the case, then we'd never be able to help anyone because we're all perfectly imperfect works in progress. But taking the time to find out where our blinders are, that which we cannot see clearly, helps us to view the world and to see others in a more just and equitable way. One of the gifts that we are given from our parents and our community is our worldview and our perspective on life. It is an act of maturity to realize that our worldview is just that. It's our worldview. It's just one perspective out of many, out of billions and billions of worldviews out there. We just have one. So even with the most loving and open-minded of parents, we are shaped by their limited worldview and their beliefs on what is right and wrong, good or bad, who is and isn't to be trusted, and what is most important in life. Up until the time that we are about 7 years old, our world exists in concrete ideas of good and bad. Our developing brains have no understanding of nuance, right? So it's inevitable that our childhood worldview puts people into very simple categories: friend or not friend, good or bad, for or against. It takes a lot of work to undo the effects of that training and that early mindset, to learn to accept others for who they are and not for what category our minds automatically want to slot them into. To become curious about the person and to get to know them on a deeper and a more individual basis. We know that Jesus did this work because of how he advocated for people who were not like himself. He grew up in a Jewish household in a Jewish area, and yet he made sure that his gospel was shared not only with Jewish men, but with women and Gentiles. I remember the word Gentiles means those who are not Jewish. Jesus did his inner work. He took the time to overcome his inner bias and his innate prejudices that he grew up with so that he could share his message of peace and compassion with everybody. Maybe this is something that he worked on in those 40 days in the desert. In the Gospel of Mark, it says that while in the wilderness, the angels took care of him. I like to think that the angels not only provided for his physical needs during that time, but for his spiritual and emotional needs too. Jesus had some growing to do, and so he spent 40 days in the desert focusing on just that. It's interesting, when you look at the origin of the word wilderness, it literally means wild deer, wilderness, wild deer. So a wilderness is a place where the wild deer run. In that case, you could say that Regina Beach is a wilderness because I see deer roaming past my window all the time. And it's kind of funny to think of Jesus hanging out in Regina Beach for his 40 days in the wilderness time. Maybe you do a little skidooing or some fishing, just hanging out. But when you look at the word desert, which is intimately connected with the word wilderness, We find that it has an even older meaning. The root word in Latin for desert is desertum, which literally means a place abandoned. When we talk about going into the desert in the metaphorical sense, we're not talking about going to a sandy, barren wilderness like the Great Sand Dunes in southwestern Saskatchewan. In a metaphorical or inner sense, when we turn to the desert, we are turning to those places within ourselves that we have abandoned or discarded. Those parts of ourselves which are ignored, dampened down, or cut off because they hurt too much or they didn't feel like they were good enough. Those are the parts of ourselves that we have cast out into our inner wilderness or our inner desert. And they are the parts of ourselves which we must reconnect with if we are to become whole. God doesn't need us walking around with half a heart or half a courage or half a brain. Just like in The Wizard of Oz, we must undertake a journey to find and claim those missing parts of ourselves, parts which we have cast out into the wilderness as we've come across the hurts and challenging experiences in our lives. Sometimes it's easier to abandon those parts of ourselves which are hurting than it is to actually deal with the hurt. Sometimes we just can't face it in the moment, so we end up turning away from those parts of ourselves. Healing includes calling all those hurting parts back home and loving and caring for them until we are ready to fully claim them again. Yesterday, I took part in an online workshop with Reverend Jan Richardson, who, among other things, is an artist and a poet. The topic of the webinar was on Jesus' time in the wilderness. When Jan spoke of the wilderness, she said that although we often talk about the wilderness as being a difficult place, a place where we don't want to go, that there is a difference between going through the wilderness and going through what St. John of the Cross called the dark night of the soul. In modern times, the phrase the dark night of the soul is often used informally to describe an extremely difficult or painful period in one's life. So, for example, after the death of a loved one or maybe a divorce, for many people, when we were isolated due to COVID, that was a real dark night of the soul. So, a dark night of the soul is an extremely difficult or painful period in one's life. And it's usually not something that we enter into willingly. It's something that's thrust upon us by life. It's something that we have no choice but to undergo. A journey through the wilderness, on the other hand, like our Lenten journey, can be voluntary. I asked Jan what she felt the difference was between the dark night of the soul and a chosen walk through the wilderness. And she says that when we're dealing with grief, especially through the dark night of the soul, it is very hard to see any benefit or anything good coming from it. And I think that's really true. When we're really hurting, when we're really grieving, it's very hard to see any sunshine. That we just feel like we're completely closed in by the darkness and by the despair. But when it is a journey through the wilderness, like a Lenten journey, there can be well springs of joy and sheltering nests. During our travels through the wilderness, we can find well springs of joy that can sustain us when our feet or our souls get tired. And we can find sheltering nests which can nurture us and give us a safe space to heal or to grow. As we go about our Lenten journeys, we may encounter places and people which renew us, which imbibe us with meaning and connection and clarity. The wilderness experience does not have to be one which is limited and meager. The wilderness can offer us such a richness of presence, grace, and discernment. The title of Reverend Richardson's webinar was Beloved is Where We Begin. She walked us through today's scripture reading from Mark, and she pointed out that before Jesus went into the wilderness, before he was tested, before he did all of this inner work, God equipped him with what he needed. So how did things happen again? So first, Jesus got baptized. Then when he rose out of the waters, he heard God's voice, which called him beloved. And it said, "This is my son, the beloved, with whom I am well pleased." And then the Spirit drove him out into the wilderness. Jan Richardson noted that before Jesus stepped into the wilderness, into seclusion, into that abandoned, deserted place, he received God's words of blessing. Jesus was equipped with God's love and blessing before he began his work of inner reorganizing and inner healing. In Jan's words, beloved is where he began, and it's also where we began. Before we do our inner work, before we can begin healing, before we can share our compassion with others, we must be grounded in God's deep love for us. So this is how it works. God fills our cup with living water so that we can in turn pour out ourselves for others. Our source is love, and it is based in God's love. All actions that we have as Christians come from God's love working through us. And Jesus knew this. He received God's love during his baptism. He integrated and embraced that love during his time in the wilderness. And then he went on to begin his ministry of sharing his love with others. So God filled his cup, Jesus drank from that cup, and then he poured that cup out for others. So the order is baptism, wilderness, ministry, blessing, integration, and then sharing God's love. Likewise, our pattern can be being open and curious with our palms upward, ready to receive God's love. Then holding that blessing, that belovedness, allowing it to sink in, allowing it to become part of us, taking it on as our spiritual identity, and then sharing God's love with others, offering it to others, realizing that we are but channels for God's love. God is source, which means that God's love is infinite. When we are tuned into our belovedness, we have access to God's unlimited wellspring of love, compassion, beauty, and grace for humankind and for all of creation. Beloved is where we begin. Baptism, wilderness, ministry, blessing, integration, sharing, belovedness, receiving, amplifying. Beloved is where we begin. Today, I am inviting folks who are at Heritage to walk an indoor labyrinth following the service. At St. Andrews, you guys will have a chance to do this at another Sunday. I will bring my indoor labyrinth with me and we'll set it up someplace so you can all experience that too during the Lenten season. And to walk a labyrinth it's not like a maze. There's only one path into the center and then back out again. And what's interesting is how that path sort of weaves towards the center and then away and back towards the center and closer and spiraling into the center. And I want you to imagine that center of a labyrinth is God's love and that state of belovedness. And to notice that as we journey through the Lenten season, because the walking the labyrinth is a metaphor for our journey, that we are constantly coming close to God's love. We are working our way towards it always. And even when it's time for us to turn around and then go back out of the labyrinth, we follow that same path. So we keep coming close again to the center, close to our belovedness, and we touch in with it as we continue walking further and further away. So even that image of a labyrinth, we can see that belovedness is not only where we begin, but it is where we are returning to. It is where we are coming from. It is an integral part of our journey. Beloved is where we begin. And as long as we remember that belovedness is the core of our being, then we will carry it with us throughout our whole lives. Beloved will also then become our middle and our end, just like the labyrinth. So think about that. Hold on to that image, because I hope that you'll think of it again when we have a chance to walk the labyrinth together in just a few weeks. So carry that image with you and consider what your Lenten journey will be for you this year. Blessings, my friends. May you have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you again soon.